Donald Trump continues to help the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, amid news that the United States has stopped supplying weapons to Ukraine. There is also news that the White House has lifted some sanctions from Russian banks, enterprises, and even the key exporter of Russian weapons. It turned out that the easing of restrictions on Russian companies was made by the United States as part of the procedure for lifting sanctions against Syria. But it's very important to examine this news in detail and thoroughly so as not to fall victim to sensational headlines. In short, the news that Trump lifted sanctions on Russia is incorrect. And in this episode, I'll explain in detail why. I'm Alexei Pichi. It's July 2nd. Let's review things step by step. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and write any comment you want. Also subscribe to my Telegram channel. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we post breaking news as soon as it comes in. So today, several media outlets reported that Donald Trump has lifted some of the sanctions on Russia. Against the backdrop of news that the United States has actually stopped supplying weapons to Ukraine, this news is perceived especially sharply. But we need to figure this out. The thing is, the United States hasn't lifted sanctions from Russia, although indirectly this can still be called a lifting of sanctions. To avoid confusion, let's go through everything step by step. The thing is, the decision by United States President Donald Trump to lift some of the sanctions previously imposed on Syria ended up benefiting the Kremlin. That's how it looks at first glance. Late in the evening on June 30, United States President Donald Trump signed an order lifting United States economic sanctions against Syria. As stated by the White House, this decision is a step towards stability and peace. Next, I will quote from Donald Trump's order regarding Syria. The United States is committed to supporting a stable, unified Syria that lives in peace with itself and its neighbors. A unified Syria that does not provide safe haven to terrorist organizations and ensures the security of its religious and ethnic minorities will support regional security and prosperity. Sanctions against the former Syrian President Bashar Assad, who fled to Russia, as well as his family members and supporters of the ousted regime in Syria, remain in effect. No one has lifted them. The American leader announced his intention to lift sanctions from Damascus back in mid-May, before he met with the new Syrian leader Ahmed Ashar in Riyadh. The White House stated that it will monitor the actions of the new Syrian authorities, including the adoption of concrete measures to normalize relations with Israel. Syrian Foreign Minister Assad al-Shibani stated that lifting the sanctions will remove obstacles to the recovery of the Syrian economy and open the country to the international community. In a statement, United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that the decree lifting the sanctions will give the Syrian people an opportunity to start a new life after the overthrow of Assad's brutal regime. Let me briefly remind you that the Islamist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, led by Ahmed Ashar, spearheaded the rebel offensive that resulted in the overthrow of Bashar Assad's regime in early December last year. The United Nations, the United States, and the United Kingdom still classify this organization as terrorist. However, an executive order by Donald Trump instructs United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio to review the status of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and possibly remove it from the list of terrorist organizations. Earlier this year, Marco Rubio called for supporting the transitional authorities in Syria, warning that failure to achieve economic progress could lead to a full-scale civil war of epic proportions. And right after all this, news emerged that lifting sanctions on Syria also affected Russians and even benefited the Kremlin. The fact is that, along with Syrian organizations, a number of Russian banks, companies, and even well-known individuals disappeared from American blacklists. For example, in the updated release from the Office of Foreign Assets Control of the United States Department of the Treasury, it is stated that sanctions have been lifted from the former president of the International Chess Federation and ex-head of Kalmykia, Kirsan Ilyumzhinov. In 2015, the American authorities accused him of supporting the regime of Syrian President Bashar Assad, and at that time, all his assets in the United States were frozen. Ilyumzhinov himself explained this by his, as he said, active international activities, including trips to North Korea and Syria, additionally meetings with Bashar Assad. Some Russian companies that were under Syrian restrictions were also included in the lifting of sanctions. This is key. I'll explain later. In particular, we're talking about the Russian Financial Alliance Bank, which belongs to that very same Ilyumzhinov. Also on the list of lifted restrictions is one that, however, already lost its license back in 2017. And Mir Business Bank is the Russian branch of the Iranian bank Meli Iran, as well as the state-owned enterprise RFK Bank Promzayrimport and the largest arms exporter of the Russian Federation, the company Rosoboronexport. In addition, the company's Global Concepts Group have been removed from the United States blacklist. STG Logistic and a whole range of other companies as well. So, as you can see, it really looks like Trump's team is lifting sanctions from Russian banks and companies. But this is exactly where the distortion lies in the news that Trump is lifting sanctions from Russia. Now we begin examining the situation more thoroughly. As of today, there are 3 American sanction regimes in effect against Russia. Russian companies, banks, individuals, and so on. The anti-Russian, Syrian, and Iranian regimes. Well, if you prefer, for convenience, Ukrainian, Syrian, and Iranian. To put it simply, on Russian companies, banks, and so on. Sanctions were imposed for the war against Ukraine, for supporting Iran, and for supporting the Syrian regime of Bashar Assad. Often, the same companies, banks, and so on would fall under all 3 sanction regimes at once. And so, on June 30th, Trump announced the official lifting of the Syrian sanctions regime. As a result, during the update of the sanctions lists, the United States removed the Syria tag from a number of Russian organizations. Now, the most important thing. For example, the company Rosoboronexport was previously under 3 sanction regimes at once: Syrian, Iranian, and anti-Russian for the war in Ukraine. Now, this company is being removed from the Syrian sanctions regime, but remains under the anti-Russian and Iranian ones, which basically means the company is still under sanctions. In other words, the sanction status of the company has not been lifted. Or another example, the Russian financial corporation RFK Bank also lost its tag. Syria, meaning it is being removed from the Syrian sanctions regime, but it remains under sanctions for its ties with North Korea. So, once again, the sanctions remain in effect. That's why, with all the emotions I understand today, many media outlets mistakenly reported the removal of Rosoboronexport and other companies from the United States sanctions lists. But, as you already understand, that's not true. The United States only made an adjustment, removing the reference to the Syrian sanctions regime, which has simply been officially closed. From now on, there is no such thing as the Syrian sanctions regime. All the mentioned companies remain under United States sanctions under other programs, meaning that no sanctions have been lifted from them. So, friends, keep your critical thinking and be sure to subscribe to my channel to know the whole truth. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.